Thank you very much, Max, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming here. I'm delighted to be back in my hometown, Vancouver. Some of my family are here, and I'm especially honored to be delivering the Mark Zacher lecture. It's no exaggeration to say he has had the most important impact on my career. He was the one, in fact, long ago when I was just starting in graduate school here. I was searching around for a topic. It was around the time of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and I was sure that I was going to be the next great Sovietologist. And I went to see Mark, and he said, you know, I think you ought to change subject matter. And there's not going to be a job for a Sovietologist. I was like, no. It's like my whole life had been, carpet had been pulled out from under me. So we talked a bit, and he said, you know, what you should look at is the impact of the telecommunications revolution on world politics. Nobody is looking into that. And it was the best choice I have made. And I want to thank Mark for that. The title of my talk is Undercover of the Net, and I think there's some subtitle that goes along with it. You really can't address this topic today without acknowledging the revelations from Edward Snowden. You can't turn on the news without a new revelation coming out from The Guardian or the New York Times. And even prior to it, cybersecurity issues regularly made the headlines. So Fortune 500 companies being breached or attacks on critical infrastructure. And it's important to all of us because our lives are now enmeshed with these technologies. Our kids, our work, our livelihoods, everything we do depends on it. The Citizen Lab, which I founded in 2001 and I direct, has had as its mission since its founding to lift the lid on cyberspace, to apply an interdisciplinary approach that combines technical interrogation, field research, and social and political analysis to find out what is going on beneath the surface of the internet. Think X-Files meets academia. We have a core staff in Toronto, but we work with networks of individuals all over the world, and we've been a kind of digital early warning system. And what we've observed over the last decade, frankly, has been really troubling. Cyberspace is changing fast, but not necessarily for the better. And there's a global battle going on right now for the future of cyberspace as policymakers and business people rush to deal with the governance and security challenges that are being thrown up at an exhausting pace. And the NSA Snowden revelations have amplified these concerns. So today in my lecture, I'm going to divide it into three parts. In part one, I'm going to briefly summarize the NSA revelations and put them in a bit of context. In the second part, I want to discuss some likely implications or consequences, which in the short term I see as being mostly bad. In the third part, I want us to discuss together what to do about it and answer the question, where do we go to from here? But before I begin, I want to lay out an assumption that informs all of my work. I believe it's not only a good thing, I believe it's critical to the long-term survival of our species that we have an open, decentralized, and secure network of communications, that citizens can exchange ideas and debate, share knowledge, and communicate in an unfettered manner. And for some time I've been warning that this network is under threat. After the Snowden revelations, I believe those threats are now magnifying. So let me begin with the Snowden revelations. As I said, just about every day you pick up a newspaper, there's a new one. So I'm not going to go through all of them. There have been so many. But I think it's worthwhile to just go through some of the highlights. The first one was about Verizon and the fact that the United States government had compelled this big telecommunications company to turn over all of the metadata that it collected about domestic communications. And that was the first time a lot of us had heard about metadata. Metadata is like the wrapper around the contents of your communications or the envelope. So not the content, but everything else but the content. And it turns out that metadata is actually very useful for intelligence purposes because it's structured data. It can be comparable. It can be analyzed by machines. And there's a lot of it that we don't even know is going on. For example, I'm sure many of you in the room, I was just searching for mine, I think I put it away, have a cell phone. Even when you're not using that cell phone, it's sending a beacon, searching for the nearest Wi-Fi router in the room, or maybe the closest cell phone tower. And in that beacon contains information about the make and model of the phone, also perhaps the fact that you are associated with it because your name is attached to that information, but most importantly, the geolocation of where you are at any one time. And this beacon is being sent out every few seconds. So the fact that all of you are here in this room with me and you all have cell phones in your pocket means that sometime down the road, you'll be associated with me. That might not be a good thing because there are a lot of people who don't like me. The second one was, of course, PRISM, which most people are aware of, and this is where the United States government compelled major internet giants, social media companies that we all associate with the internet, like Google, Yahoo, and so on, Microsoft, Facebook, Skype, to provide access to data streams. And at first the companies denied their involvement or even knowledge of this, and later we found out that it was because they were under national security letters, they weren't allowed to acknowledge the existence of this program or their cooperation with it. After that, one that I found particularly interesting goes by the codename Tempora, and that's where we found out about what the UK Signals Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, is doing, intercepting cables that land on UK soil and essentially gathering up a large portion of the world's telecommunications traffic, enormous volume of data. After that was Bull Run and Edge Hill. These were programs operated by both the United States and the United Kingdom to covertly shape and weaken encryption standards. So encryption that we use, for example, for banking or for sensitive communications, it turned out that the NSA and GCHQ had been systematically working to introduce sometimes corruptions into those standards or to shape the involvement. And that's where we first heard about Canadian involvement in these programs as well. After that came a much more high-profile expose of our own Signals Intelligence Agency, the Communications Security Establishment of Canada, the fact that our agency had quite ingeniously infiltrated the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy and actually been able to really closely track a lot of the cell phone communications that were going on. It's funny, I start my book, Black Code, with an anecdote. I used to open lectures like this by having people raise their hands if they have heard of CSEC, and almost certainly there would be maybe one, almost always zero. And now I think it's remarkable that probably everybody in this room now has heard of the Communications Security Establishment of Canada. Of course, recently, revelations that the NSA had been eavesdropping on German Chancellor Angela Merkel's cell phone, including her personal phone. And this had been going on for over a decade when she was in the opposition. And then, of course, that they had been doing the same with 35 other world leaders. And that's causing a bit of tension between allies. And then I think this was just a couple of days ago, the Google tap. So with PRISM, NSA, GCHQ go through the front door, go with a letter asking them for cooperation and then giving them a gag order. In this case, what they did is they went through the back door, if you will. So they essentially somehow managed to subvert the connection points where data is flowing between data centers in the large cloud computing centers operated by Google and Microsoft. Stepping back and looking at all of this, it's really quite remarkable. And the common thread among these stories is that the NSA is essentially subverting the internet and turning it into a massive surveillance tool. Now, I think one comment I hear among my colleagues and some people who have experience in national security issues say, none of this is really new. We shouldn't be surprised by it. And I think there's some truth to that. It's useful to spend a bit of time reviewing the history. So, of course, espionage is sometimes referred to as the second oldest profession. And even the history of modern signals intelligence goes back quite a long way, back to World War I with the founding of GCHQ. After World War II, you have the UK-USA agreement was signed, which formalized the Five Eyes, the cooperation among Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK, and the United States. Even some of the programs and operations are decades old. The one I love to bring up is early on among the revelations were reports that the NSA had been eavesdropping on the United Nations. Well, in fact, the very first meeting that was held in San Francisco to create the charter for the United Nations, there was significant signals intelligence there. The United States, the predecessor to the National Security Agency, had ordered Western Union, which was the largest telegraphic carrier at the time, to essentially intercept all telegraphic communications of all the world leaders and then hand them over to the United States government. They were still under wartime censorship powers. So all of the conversations, the private communications among diplomats at the founding of the United Nations were under total surveillance. There were also, during the Cold War, both the United States and Russia built really quite an arsenal of sea, land, air, and space-based signals and imagery surveillance systems. And some of these are fantastic. I really marvel at some of the technology, like these systems that were designed to collect stray microwave signals that bounced off the moon and returned back to Earth, which is really incredible. And of course, something we haven't heard about a lot, but I'm really interested, are space-based reconnaissance systems. There's the LaCrosse synthetic aperture radar systems that can see through day, night, all weather conditions down to the level of 1 meter. The most advanced optical reconnaissance systems can see down to a resolution of 6 centimeters from space. We'll probably hear more about that. Now, the main feature of most of this throughout the Cold War, very important to understand, was that it was a spy versus spy kind of game. The signals intelligence, the surveillance that was going on was focused on each other, on diplomatic communications, on things like ballistic missile tests and early warning, sensitive diplomatic communications. There are also quite a few details in the public domain. If you look at some of the histories of intelligence written by people like James Banford or Richard Aldrich in the UK about the GCHQ, these were published well before the Snowden revelations, and if you read them now, you'll see that, in fact, a lot of the details were already well known. So, to some degree, those who say there is nothing new in these revelations, or you also hear people kind of crack on sarcastically saying, I'm shocked to find gambling in this establishment, are to some degree correct. But there are, on the other hand, evolutionary changes that have occurred, and there was one big significant watershed that fundamentally transformed the nature of intelligence. And it was 9/11. 9/11 is the what's new part, in my opinion. Several things in the wake of those horrific attacks that we know more about now occurred during this time. First of all, the focus turns inward from this spy versus spy focus to all of society. And in part, that's a function of the changing nature of threats. So you have non-state actors, terrorist cells, and so on, trying to figure out who within society is going to cause mass violence becomes a major concern. So the focus turns inward, and that's very important. You also see a culture shift at the time. This recognition that all bets are off. based on a failure to connect the dots at the time and prevent those attacks from happening. So you have this extreme urgency, especially in the United States. You know, take the gloves off. This is a different era that we're in, and we've got to deal with it. And you have at this time a growing irreverence towards the rule of law. In fact, sometimes even an outright dismissal of it, and a condoning of kind of bending the rules, edge of the envelope type thinking throughout the intelligence community. Of course, you also had at this time legal changes. So the Patriot Act was passed that substantially removed checks and balances over intelligence operations and made it easier for intelligence and law enforcement to share information, not only in the United States, but in UK, Canada, and in many other countries around the world, dramatically empowering law enforcement and intelligence. You also have at this time technological developments and a shift in the defense industrial base. Probably the most well-known of them at that time was a program called Total Information Awareness. How many people have heard of Total Information Awareness? Not many. Okay. Well, this was a program that was put forward right after 9/11, and the idea was very much apropos of the Snowden revelations to gather up all communications on citizens, all credit card transactions, all telephone communications, store it in a database, and have it available for analysts to interrogate. The problem was that it was associated with John Poindexter of Iran-Contra fame. He was in charge of it. And that, of course, freaked a lot of people out. If he's in charge of it, we can't trust this guy. He wants to suck up all of our communications. And it also had a really freaky-looking logo, this kind of Masonic thing with the eye, right? And it never made it through Congress. But what, in fact, happened, and we now know through research that was done by people, is that this program was not killed at all, even though it didn't get approval in Congress. It simply went deep black and was atomized into a number of different smaller programs. And then throughout the 2000s, we had an explosion in what I call the cybersecurity industrial complex. Top secret America, as the Washington Post's Dana Priest calls it. Dozens of defense contractors profiting from a mushrooming black budget of tens of billions of dollars, developing surveillance, big data analytics, and even offensive computer network attack capabilities. And this has been going on throughout the decade. So gathering up enormous amounts of information about all of us that we leave around us like a trail. And it's extraordinary. To process all of that data, the National Security Agency, you may have heard, is building this huge complex in Utah. And I flew over it just about a month ago. It is really impressive to see from an airplane. It's enormous. It's like $1.75 billion headquarters. And they call it the NSA's cloud, which I think is quite appropriate. If you stand back and you look at the volume of data that is being collected here and stored for later analysis, it is really quite mind-blowing. So this sea change in the intelligence posture of the United States and its allies happens at the same time as two fundamental shifts are occurring that are essential to understand for different reasons entirely. The first relates to the ecosystem of communications itself and to our own digital habits. Now, people talk about communication revolutions all the time, and there have been prior revolutions that have come to mind, like invention of the printing press and television, radio, and so on. But my belief is that the biggest change has happened just within the last 3 to 5 years. The rise of social networking, the shift to cloud computing, and the rapid emergence of mobile forms of connectivity. If you look at each of these, social media, of course everyone knows this, it's exploded now. And the way that people communicate through social media is really quite fundamentally different than what has happened in the past. People are essentially turning their digital lives inside out. More than 1 billion tweets are sent every 2 to 3 days across Twitter. Here is my dog. This is my place of work. This is what I eat for lunch. These are my friends. This is my phone numbers. Individuals can be mapped in space and time with a degree of sophistication that would make the greatest tyrants of days past envious, mostly as a result of our own digital habits. Cloud computing. It's wonderful. It's untethered PCs and networks and allowed access to these huge computing facilities, but it raises significant jurisdictional and privacy issues. For example, prior to the Snowden revelations, very few citizens outside of the United States realize that when they rely on Google, Gmail, Google Docs, and so on, even data that's stored on Google servers resident in their own countries are subject to U.S. Patriot Act provisions because Google is domiciled in the United States, and the Act compels Google and companies like it to turn over data when required, no matter where that data is stored. And now they do, right, as we found out. Mobile frees us up in many ways, but like I talked about before, ties us down in a whole bunch of other ways. In a dense network of geo-temporal location data points that follow us around with relentless precision. From one perspective, these are mobile phones, great communications devices, but from another, they are the most efficient tracking devices ever made. Every few seconds, as I said, a beacon to the local Wi-Fi tower or cell phone, following you around relentlessly. And all three are integrated now, too. We use our mobile device to access our Gmail and Google Docs and update our Twitter and Facebook accounts, all with the same device. Apple just announced, and this blows my mind, that they've crossed the 50 billion app download threshold. 50 billion apps on your mobile phones. That's about 7 for each and every person on the planet, each of which hives off information about our digital habits when we click on their terms of service and sends it somewhere to be shared with someone. And let's not forget about the so-called Internet of Things. Tens of billions of internet-connected devices and potential sensors of our actions, habits, thoughts, social relations, and movements. Now, taken together, I believe these shifts in communicating constitute one of the biggest transformations in communications history, purely in terms of the amount of private information we now entrust to third parties. But what's even more significant is how we are going about securing it all. At the very same time that we are in the midst of turning our digital lives inside out, the world's most powerful surveillance machinery is turning inwards on all of us. A surveillance machine whose overarching intention is to shield itself from public scrutiny, to barely acknowledge its own existence, to operate in a cloak of secrecy. In my opinion, that's something that deserves a huge conversation that we haven't had yet, a kind of new social contract. The second big change, I said there are two, the second big change happening simultaneously is one that very few people ever notice when it comes to the internet and cyberspace. And that is that the who of cyberspace is changing as fast as the what is cyberspace. Radically and fast. There is a major demographic shift occurring as the center of gravity of the internet and cyberspace moves from the north and the west of the planet, where it was invented, to the south and the east. And the culture of cyberspace is changing accordingly. While the West may have built the internet, built cyberspace, the West, and by that I mean the United States and Europe, now makes up just about a third of it. Presently, the Asian region comprises 45% of the world's internet population, which is the most by region, but it ranks only 6th in terms of penetration rates at 28%, meaning there's this huge population yet to be connected, most of them young. It's significant that of the 6 billion mobile devices in the world today, over 4 billion of them are in the developing world. In 2001, just 8 out of 100 people in the developing world had a mobile phone subscription, 8 out of 100. Now nearly 80 out of 100 do. And some of the fastest growing online populations are emerging from the world's weakest states, the failed, the fragile, for whom these technologies are empowering. In many of these countries, religion plays a more important role in governance. Many of them are autocratic or authoritarian regimes. In the wake of the Snowden revelations, what will be considered legitimate practice there? What that we do here will influence or legitimize what goes on there. Remember, these countries and their populations are entering into cyberspace at a much different time than the early adopters. They're coming after the PRISM revelations and with the model of the NSA in mind, at a time when cybersecurity is at the top of the international agenda, when products and services of unparalleled surveillance and computer network exploitation power are being offered commercially. Which brings us to the consequences. Now, what are the consequences of the Snowden revelations? We could have an interesting debate about that, and I do all the time with my friends and colleagues. Some of them think it's going to be mostly positive, that this is going to reinvigorate investigative journalism. And we see evidence of that. The Snowden stories come out, and then reporters start digging more and finding about other programs. But I think collective attention spans can be short, budgets are tight, news cycles are fickle, and so on. I think it's noteworthy that in spite of all of these revelations, we've not had a major congressional investigation worthy of the scope of what's going on in the United States, and General Keith Alexander wasn't fired, right? He still had his job until recently announcing that he's going to step down. And I do believe that public reaction may get quickly exhausted, and the scandal will become something that we get used to. We just see more and more revelations. More likely, in my opinion, are a series of consequences that are bad in the long run for the internet, for democracy and human rights. And it's to these that I now turn. Now, to begin with, we have to dispel a myth about the relationship between territoriality and cyberspace. The physical geography of cyberspace matters. Now, most of us approach the internet without thinking much beyond our computer screen in front of us. We send an email and it magically appears on the other side of the planet. But it's important to understand that beneath that email, that tweet, is a complex material, logistical, and regulatory political system that spans multiple jurisdictions, from the local to the national to the international. While the text, the image, the video may all seem within our grasp on our desktops and handheld devices, they are not. Data that we handle, that we assume is in our possession, are in fact transported to us in an instant over cables and through radio waves from arrays of servers, many of which are far from us in another political jurisdiction than the one in which we live. And those different political jurisdictions matter a lot. Take cloud computing. Data that used to be stored in our desktops, in our filing cabinets, we now entrust to cloud computing systems. But where exactly are the clouds? Well, the answer is that a fairly disproportionate number of them are floating across the territory of the United States of America. And that's a huge home field advantage. Michael Hayden, the former director of the NSA and the CIA, said it best. He said, oops, I'm sorry, jumped ahead of myself. Got to get that up there. We built it here, and it was quintessentially American. I love this. He's being very frank. He's a very frank person. He said that partially due to that, much of traffic goes through American servers where the government takes a picture of it for intelligence purposes. Remarkable. But when you look at that, which country, upon that admission, is going to want to route its information through U.S. territory and U.S. servers upon hearing that from a former NSA director? Here's I love this cartoon as well. I think this reflects a lot of the European reaction right now among European policymakers. They're starting to push for legislation that will restrict the use of U.S.-based cloud computing systems and instead force those systems to local jurisdictions. Just today, there was this story, and it's not unique. You see this in just about every country in Europe right now, looking to keep internet, email traffic inside the borders. One of the best well-known was the Brazilian president when she found out that her communications were being spied upon. She devoted, I think, 20 minutes of her speech at the United Nations just to the NSA scandal and has aggressively promoted the adoption of locally hosted, owned and operated Brazilian systems. And well, okay, you can clap at that. Go ahead. I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you. Now, a lot of people in the United States are focusing on the loss to U.S. businesses, which, frankly, this is going to be substantial, probably hundreds of billions of dollars. Suddenly, the U.S. has, and it's very interesting to me, a Huawei problem. Do you know what I mean by that? So Huawei is a Chinese company. And you may remember, as I begin to explain this, it was in the news a while back before the Snowden revelations. We can't trust Huawei because the Chinese government may have put a back door in it. Huawei is a manufacturer of routers, the routers that essentially run the infrastructure of the internet. And in many countries, Australia, United States, and so on, it's actually, they've banned it from being used on government computer networks. I think the United States now has a Huawei problem. Now, it's important to remember that these processes, let's call them processes of nationalization of the internet, right? Taking this global infrastructure and nationalizing it, bringing it back within territorial boundaries, were actually going on well before the Snowden revelations, right? There was a process underway. But what will happen is that many political leaders will find the Snowden revelations a convenient excuse to ramp up tighter government controls on the internet. If you look, say, 15 years ago and did a survey, if governments had any policies about the internet at all, and many of them didn't, if they did, it was kind of hands-off, laissez-faire, let's not get involved. If you fast forward to today, many governments impose a wide range of controls on the internet. They've gradually imposed borders, firewalls, sensors designed to exert greater state control. We've seen a normalization of national internet censorship practices from a handful of countries to more than dozens today. If you live in the Middle East, this is what you're more likely to see surfing the internet. Building borders and putting in place controls has become the norm rather than the exception. Throughout the 2000s at the Citizen Lab, as part of this project, the Open Net Initiative, we did systematic research involving field research and technical interrogation in more than 75 countries around the world. And we found over that time that the number of countries engaged in internet censorship had ballooned to around over 45. Some countries block access to entire services, like Pakistan, for example, right now, blocks access to all of YouTube. And these technical means of building borders in cyberspace have been complemented by more interventionist state regulations applied to cyberspace. So you have new stifling laws. You have bloggers being arrested for tweets that they post. You have criminalization of access to certain types of web content. You have regulations that require the private sector to police the internet on behalf of governments. You have governments making demands that companies place data centers within their jurisdictions so that they can be more easily subject to government surveillance requirements. And all of this was going on long before the Snowden revelations. Detaching from American-owned networks and from the NSA will now be seen as a convenient and politically popular excuse for many of these countries whose real intent is to subject the internet to a bevy of state controls. So we're leading, in other words, to the balkanization of the net, which is going to accelerate in the wake of the Snowden revelations. Another set of reactions will happen at the international level, as countries who want to do this, who want to subject the internet to nationalized controls, will look to other countries for support, to forums like the United Nations, the International Telecommunications Union, and other international forums to build legitimacy and broader support for national controls. In December 2012, some of you might remember, there was a big standoff at the International Telecommunications Union between a group of governments, mainly China, Russia, and like-minded countries, who wanted to push internet governance towards the United Nations and the International Telecommunications Union. And then another block of countries, led primarily by the United States, who described themselves as the Freedom Online Coalition. And this was pitted as this major dramatic episode that was going to decide the future of internet governance. As it turned out, there was a victory for the Freedom Online Coalition at that meeting. Agreement never went through and the fears never materialized. But if you look now, in the wake of the Snowden revelations, the Freedom Online Coalition has really had the diplomatic wind sucked right out of its sails. Now, even more significant than what's going on at international levels are what's happening closer to the ground, at the regional level, among regional security organizations. There'll be changes there among those organizations that will not be closely monitored. They don't make the news in forums like ASEAN or the Gulf Cooperation Council or this fun-looking group, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, this organization has a regional anti-terror structure known by its Mission Impossible sounding acronym, RATS. I kid you not. RATS has engaged in military and policing exercises designed to counter Arab Spring-like movements from erupting within their jurisdictions, within their respective countries. They've coordinated the development of censorship and surveillance infrastructure development throughout Russia and Central Asia, and are now moving into regions like Africa and Asia. RATS will be given new impetus now, and we should keep our eyes out for what is going on in these regional security organizations. Alongside domestic controls and international and regional coordination, there will be many countries who will want to model the more offensively minded elements that have come to light about the NSA, though they'll almost certainly follow a different playbook. For example, some governments have seen the malaise of the cybercrime underworld as a strategic opportunity and have exploited it for purposes of espionage. The Citizen Lab is probably most well known for one of our cyber espionage reports that Max mentioned off the top, the GhostNet report. And it's interesting if you look at this report in light of what I'm talking about now. So for those of you who didn't know, that report began with investigations into the office of the Dalai Lama and Tibetan organizations who suspected their computers were being monitored by the Chinese. So they called in the Citizen Lab and we collected data from northern India where they're located, analyzed their computers, and after many months of forensic investigation, our researchers found that not only that they were indeed totally infiltrated, but the same people who had managed to infiltrate their computers had also done so to hundreds of government agencies, including prime ministers' offices, foreign affairs departments, embassies, international organizations like the United Nations. Among the victims of the GhostNet network were ASEAN, the Associated Press, the United Nations, the Taiwan Stock Exchange, the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, hundreds of others. Now, the attackers were able to compromise computers in these locations by means of basic social engineering techniques, typically by sending emails that are carefully crafted to entice the victims to open their malicious payloads. And this is a letter received by one of the victims, in this case the Office of the Dalai Lama. As you can see, it appears to come from a sympathetic organization looking to provide support for a Tibetan publication. So it's not your typical spam or an advertisement for Viagra or something like that. It incorporates real details gathered by the attackers that give the appearance of authenticity. And of course, receiving that, you might very well be tempted to open it. But when you do, unfortunate things happen. In this case, the attackers had embedded in the attachment a Trojan horse called GhostRat, and this is the interface for GhostRat, so this is what the attackers see. It gave them extraordinary capabilities, allowed them to silently remove files from computers under their control, take screenshots and record keystrokes, even turn on the audio and video capture devices, effectively turning the computers of unsuspecting victims into silent taps. GhostRat, this Trojan, can be downloaded from the internet for free today. You can do it after this lecture. It's been translated into multiple languages to make it more user-friendly, and it's a constant daily menace for dozens of NGOs and human rights organizations, many of whom the Citizen Lab studies and reports on a daily basis. This is not a billion-dollar program. It's cheap, easy to use, readily deployable. It's not rocket science. It's not even UBC computer science, right? This is more like basement science, but no less effective. With tools like GhostRat, we've entered the age of do-it-yourself cyber espionage, and what will surely be an ever-expanding garden of homegrown, localized versions of the NSA. What might we expect from these homegrown NSAs? Well, I think we should consider the cases of Iran and Syria. Now, not too long ago, it was very fashionable to kind of mock authoritarian regimes when it came to the internet. But they have really shown a resilience that belies the conventional wisdom. Our research at the Citizen Lab has followed closely these regimes and how they've evolved over time to become very adept at using technologies to subvert opposition movements. They're getting very savvy about how to manipulate the space to their advantage, including the private companies that own and operate it. And so the NSA revelations will undoubtedly aid legitimacy and not to mention new impetus to their approach. For example, take the Green Movement. In 2009, you may remember, associated with Iran, something called the Green Movement erupted. Some people called it a Twitter revolution because of the way that the demonstrators and opposition groups made use of social media. But the Iranian authorities took countermeasures aimed at controlling the spaces online for resistance and dissent. And not just by censoring access to websites, they employed more offensive actions. The internet was slowed down in many cities, and there were periods when it was not accessible at all. It essentially ground to a halt. SMS messaging and mobile phone connections were suspended or jammed. Through evidence that has subsequently emerged, we now know that the Iranian authorities were able to get the cooperation of Nokia Siemens, the largest cell phone carrier in the country, who turned over user data to the Revolutionary Guard, Iran's own version of PRISM, and this is 2009. Cyber organizers found themselves being targeted and arrested. The Syrian regime has employed similar tactics against the Syrian opposition, targeting computers of opposition groups using malicious software, commercial spyware, and even advanced surveillance equipment, much of it manufactured in the West. Syrian networks have been infiltrated, members arrested, tortured, and murdered. This conflict has shown vividly how online insecurities have underpinned offline atrocities. You can be sure other autocratic regimes are taking note. And these cases, I believe, are playbooks for asymmetrical warfare for autocratic regimes, who will no doubt justify their actions as merely local variations of Cyber Command, the NSA, and active defense. Now, for many of us, this is daunting and horrifying, I'm sure, but not for all. For some, it's a business opportunity. As cybersecurity needs have grown, a massive industrial complex has mushroomed to service and profit from it. Their wares are sold at obscure international trade shows like this one, which are typically restricted to defense, law enforcement, and intelligence agencies. Now, it's important to understand that these products and services are not restricted to liberal democratic countries, to the NSAs, the FBIs, the CSECs of the world. They're showing up on a worldwide level and for a variety of purposes. In the short term, the NSA revelations will send a bonanza through this market as governments reach for the latest spyware. Now, over the years at the Citizen Lab, again, we have uncovered that many of the countries who censor the internet rely on products and services developed by Western manufacturers. Citizen Lab released reports that unearthed the use of Smart Filter in Iran in 2005, Fortinet in Burma in 2006, WebSense in Yemen, Tunisia, and the United Arab Emirates in 2008 and 2009, all companies headquartered in Silicon Valley. We have published several reports that detail how a Canadian company, NetSweeper, sells censorship products and services to ISPs in Yemen, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and right now it underpins the Great Firewall of Pakistan. We published 3 reports on Blue Coat. The first report we published identified that devices manufactured by Blue Coat that could be used for censorship and surveillance were used in Burma and Syria, not only to censor, but to isolate and identify particular types of communication traffic associated with pro-democracy activists in the context of what many consider to be crimes against humanity going on. Blue Coat first denied the findings, then conceded the evidence that they could no longer deny, which brought about calls for a U.S. congressional investigation and ultimately fines levied against a reseller of Blue Coat products. Our research has also uncovered troubling instances of advanced spyware sold by British and Italian companies being used in some of the world's most notorious human rights abusing countries, such as that produced and sold by the notorious Gamma Group. In May 2012, we were alerted that Bahraini and United Arab Emirates activists were being targeted with apparently malicious emails. During interrogations, after they were arrested, they were presented with transcripts of their own private conversations over Skype. And when they were released, they thought, something's not right. How could that be going on? So they turned their computers over to Bloomberg reporters who shared them with our researchers for analysis. And we did forensic analysis, looked at the email. Turned out that embedded in the legitimate emails were malicious software. And when you did a forensic analysis of the memory dump of the malicious software, lo and behold, a signature identifying the product FinSpy, which is a product manufactured by Gamma Group based in the United Kingdom. We then took that signature, and our researchers, very clever, scanned the entire internet looking for this signature. It took many months. And what we were able to find was that all over the world, there were command and control servers of this FinSpy product made by Gamma Group in places like Mexico, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Indonesia, and so on. The scan took roughly 2 months and involves sending 12 billion packets. It's really quite ingenious. But what it found, of course, was very disturbing. And our research has really only picked at the surface of a major field. Products that provide advanced deep packet inspection, content filtering, social network mining, cell phone tracking, and even computer network attack capabilities are being developed by US, Canadian, and European firms and marketed worldwide to regimes seeking to limit democratic participation, isolate and identify opposition, and infiltrate meddlesome adversaries abroad. And that market knows no boundaries. We're seeing Chinese, Indian, Brazilian firms stepping into the same marketplace. After the Snowden revelations, will any of these countries be willing to accept our self-serving moralizing as a constraint on what they do? If the NSA can pursue these capabilities, products, and services, why can't we? They'll certainly say. We just have a different sense of what is a security threat, and it happens to be citizens in our own countries. So adding this all up, it looks pretty bleak to me. We have a balkanization of the open internet as it's subject to fracturing and state controls. We have the spread of surveillance technologies and practices that will be directed towards opposition groups. The next Arab Spring, I believe, will be squelched before it even begins. And lastly, we have an escalating arms race in cyberspace that could trigger misunderstanding, leading potentially to an armed conflict. What to do? Well, here I think the Snowden revelations offer us an opportunity to step back and ask a more fundamental set of questions. As I said at the beginning, we've gone through this massive shift in society, one that requires a deep conversation, a wholesale rethink of the relationship between citizens, states, and the private sector, and especially the role of vast signals intelligence agencies born in the Cold War with enormous powers needs to be reevaluated. When it comes to cybersecurity, we need to ask, security for whom? Security for what? Now, whenever the language of security is invoked, we tend to default to particular tendencies and approaches. Tendencies and approaches characterized by things like hierarchy, secrecy, building fences and walls to the world outside. And you can see this happening all over the place. As the old saying goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. As compelling as this tradition may be, we have to admit, though, it fits awkwardly in a world where divisions between inside and outside are blurred. Threats can emerge as easily within as without. And that which requires securing, namely cyberspace, is a globally networked commons of information. Ultimately, this paradigm is incompatible with a free, open, and secure planetary-wide internet, and ultimately with liberal democracy. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Another alternative comes from the opposite end of the spectrum. There are many of my friends who are outraged now that the machinations have been exposed, want to do away with it all, eliminate surveillance altogether, and take back the internet from governments and corporations. But organized government is essential to the protection of the very rights we cherish in the first place. Without it, they'd quickly dissolve and we'd find ourselves in a Hobbesian world of might makes right. I believe we need to take a long view. Remediation to all of this will not be easy. It will require deliberate, coordinated, and persistent efforts across multiple fronts. And some of these are cultural changes, and changes in habits and power relations involving large, formidable institutions with enormous wealth and leverage at their disposal. And the forces operating against all of this are considerable. But we have to have a strategy. We have to do something. So where to begin? Well, first, I think we need to start at home and remind ourselves of some basic principles around checks and balances. We need to restore oversight, transparency, and accountability in liberal democracies and work outwards to expand the liberal democratic core. We don't need a new theory. We don't need to invent some cyber theory. We just need to remind ourselves of some basic principles at the heart of democracy, principles like mixture, division, and restraint. And these have been lost. We need to recover them and reimpose them on our governments. Maybe we have to find new agencies and empower old ones that will help do this. It's clear that the system of checks and balances in the United States has been subverted. At least they have a system of checks and balances. In our own country, CSEC is not subject to any meaningful oversight whatsoever. That needs to change. Secondly, I believe we need to extend oversight, transparency, and accountability to the private sector. For those of you who were here last year for my predecessor's talk, John Ruggie gave the first Mark Zacher lecture. He's most well known for putting forward a series of principles about corporate self-governance. I think we need to encourage that through forums like the Global Network Initiative. But we also need to build independent watchdog capacities, especially regarding companies that orbit around the cybersecurity industrial complex. The revolving doors of people who sit on boards of companies and then go back to the intelligence and military communities must be checked somehow. And I believe the role of universities is especially important in this regard as an independent watchdog. We need to de-securitize the engineering communities that run the internet. And that requires a bit of explanation. If you go back in time to the early days of the internet functioned because of the actions of a group of engineers who essentially ran it largely without users being aware of what was going on beneath the surface. And it operated on a system of trust and peer relations. That trust has gradually been broken down as engineers are drawn into national security paradigms. And the Edward Snowden revelations show that they've been usurped, actually. Somehow we need to de-securitize these communities, insulate them from national security rivalries. That will not be easy. Fourth, I believe we need to distribute governance of the internet as widely as possible, and especially give meaning to this empty euphemism of multi-stakeholderism. We need to open up decision-making and rule-making forums to civil society participation. This will not be easy because governments and companies dominate the agendas of these forums because they can intend to enforce. We can no longer accept decisions made behind closed doors. Lastly, a cultural shift is required among all of you, all of us users. We need to change the way we think about this technology. It's not some kind of special magic that just works. I believe that one way to do this is to recover the original notion of the term hacking, which may surprise a lot of you in this room because the term now is almost entirely synonymous with breaking the law. Originally, it had a very positive connotation. It referred to somebody who had an ethic of experimentation and curiosity about technology, not accepting technology at face value, lifting the lid on it, understanding how it works beneath the surface. I believe that this ethic needs to be taught at the lowest possible levels and be encouraged throughout all of society. No longer can we just send an email or a tweet and not understand what happens beneath the surface. Now, I'm not idealistic about any of this. I realize this will take time. I see this rather as a roadmap to recovery, and a long road it is going to be. Now, I'd like to end my lecture with this quotation, which you can take a minute to read. I think that's a pretty apt description of the internet, or maybe something like Wikipedia, isn't it? These are not my words. They weren't written about Wikipedia or the internet. They were written more than 70 years ago by H.G. Wells in his essay, The World Brain. I love H.G. Wells, and I often think, imagine if H.G. Wells were alive today to see how close we have come to achieving that dream, only to allow fear to bring about its demise. We have indeed created a kind of world brain. The problem is that it is a typically aggressive, insecure, and all too human one. Thank you very much.
Ron has agreed to take questions, and he's also agreed to sign copies of his book, which Kids Books is making available out in the lobby. So why don't we take maybe 20, 25 minutes for questions. Ron will handle the questions and be the traffic cop.
Sure.
But again, as always, a reminder to people to try to be as succinct as possible so that Ron can repeat the question, and that way get picked up on the
Do the people need mics in the audience, maybe, or do we want to? I'll just repeat it. I'll repeat it. Okay. Yes, sir.
To have said that he wished he had invented a lawnmower instead of the AK-47. I don't want to hear.
For those of you who didn't hear, Kalishnikov said he wished he invented what was a lawnmower instead of the machine gun. Are there any parallels here? Maybe. I think the best parallel I can think of there is this engineering community that I was talking about. The Citizen Lab works closely because of the nature of the research that we do with people who come from forensic backgrounds, cybersecurity backgrounds, researchers and others who have worked deep in the bowels of the internet dealing with cybercrime issues. And for many years, I know some of these people personally, they felt that whenever they were engaged with law enforcement or intelligence agencies, they didn't really think much about it. They just went along with that sort of thing because they thought, well, that's the right thing to do. The people in uniforms and law enforcement, well, they're the good guys, and then we know we're dealing with the bad guys, and everything seemed kind of black and white. And a lot of what went on was actually quite noble, very good cooperation. But now I think this community feels like they've been used and subtly manipulated. And the system of trust upon which all of that is based has broken down. And of all the things that I have spoken about with respect to threats to internet openness, I believe this may be one of the most serious. Because the engineers, the computer scientists, most of whom come from universities, are the ones that built the internet and have kept it functioning. And they've done it purely on the basis of trust and reputation. So when you remove that and you introduce suspicion and paranoia, national security rivalries, things begin to break down. And I think some of the people who are involved in that community may have second thoughts about what they did in the past, contributing to what we now know were subtle manipulations of the basic infrastructure of the internet for national security purposes. Way up at the back there. Yes.
Comment on the deep web and its role in the future, or how you see it might evolve?
What do you mean by deep web? Because I hear many different references to this. I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I guess part of the problem is I don't really know exactly what it is. I've just heard references myself, like this underweb or deep web that's even bigger than the Googleable internet. So I guess it's anything that's not Googleable.
So, yeah, I mean, it's there are a lot of things that go on beneath the surface of most internet users' daily experiences. A lot of, he yelled it from the back, so I thought he's asking about the deep web. What is the future of the deep web? And I was asking, what does he mean by deep web? So there are many worlds in the internet. A lot of them are obscure and populated by people who are hobbyists and so on. Then there are other obscure parts of the internet that are really quite malignant. There's trading in child pornography, for example, that is, just about everyone in their right mind would find horrible and objectionable. And then there are parts of the deep web, of the internet, that are used by activists to protect themselves, especially human rights activists. The NSA and other agencies like it have worked systematically to try to remove anonymity as much as possible from the equation so that they can understand everything that's going on and what is being communicated. And that's a difficult, tricky issue, because the same systems that give anonymity to people who use it for noble purposes, like whistleblowers, human rights activists, are also used by people who do it for terrible things. And that's a tough balance. And it's something that I think has to be addressed in a thoughtful, rational manner involving law enforcement agencies. So it's not a question of either or. The question for a lot of us that we've forgotten about, I think we need to remind ourselves, is about proper oversight of law enforcement intelligence agencies when they engage in any type of investigation of things like that are going on, that require serious efforts. Yes, Dan.
I have a great question for you. You have pictures up there of the NSA, right? The wonderful buildings. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking, the NSA has IT people to protect the NSA's network. That's all fine and dandy. But the NSA is not going to protect my personal network that I run at home. And here's my question for you. I don't want to be trusting Norton Antivirus and all these antivirus companies for the rest of my life. I would like to be able to have a device that I can monitor myself so I can find out where this malware is coming from, who these bad guys are, and catch them. And if I can't catch them, take the information, like their IP address or whatever, and send it to the right people so that the right people can catch these criminals and deal with them.
Okay, so for those of you who didn't hear, this person, essentially what you don't want to do is delegate your security to some large nameless agency. You want to be able to do it yourself.
I'll give you a great example.
Okay.
I have undertaken setting up my network as a honeypot or trap, and trying to trap the criminal trying to get into my network at home. I have found several within the last week.
He's tracking criminals at home.
And I have found them, and they are...
I believe.
And they are affecting 6,000 computers. Those 6,000 computers are overseas. We can't touch them. So what do we do?
Well, what you're describing is analogous to what researchers at the Citizen Lab do, in fact, right? We track malicious software, not that's targeting individuals so much as human rights organizations and others at risk. What to do about it? It's a really important question, because cybercrime, malicious activities on the internet that you're describing operate transnationally. They operate internationally but hide in jurisdictions where law enforcement is lax. And international cooperation around policing cybercrime, in spite of all of the things I've said here, tends to be hampered by jurisdictional issues. It's definitely one of the things that has to be addressed, because of all the experiences I have doing the research that I've done over the last 10 years, I'm dumbfounded by how large the underbelly of cybercrime is. It is enormous, and it's affecting most people in this room. You're probably not even aware of it. What worries me more, though, is not just cybercrime in random sense, but when it's repurposed, the same techniques, tradecraft, viruses, and so on, are repurposed by governments and turned against citizens. I don't have an easy answer for you, unfortunately. So, hold on. I've got to get other people. A lot of people with their hands up, so we can talk more about it later. Okay. Okay. So, yes, sir.
I loved your talk tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see this on another level. I work in the media where there's a lot of spin. So the same information can be twisted and turned. That same data can be used to believe that God is the way language itself is used is really important because that's how we communicate tonight. A bomber without an air force is called a terrorist. The Homeland Security Act was written before 9/11. And the reason why Afghanistan wasn't bombed and Iraq was is because Iraq had more targets.
Yeah, why?
And so basically, George Carlin said there's too much bullshit, it's not good for anybody. How can you tell the bullshit from the truth in what you're doing?
The question was, how can we tell how can we separate the bullshit from the truth in what I'm saying? Oh, in what I'm doing? Well,
One's real and not.
yeah.
And within your own
So that's a really good question, and we think about it a lot, and I think it underscores a point I made in my presentation about the importance of universities having a special role in providing a safeguard and a watchdog function. There's a reason that the Citizen Lab is based at the University of Toronto and not set up as an NGO somewhere. We take very seriously the tradition that goes along with doing research at the university, the system of peer review, for example. Ethical issues we take very seriously. And sometimes those things are overlooked or trivialized, even by some of my colleagues. But we've had some experiences that have really brought home to us how important it is to take those principles of scholarship very seriously. So first of all, we publish everything that we do, right? Every method that we employ at the Citizen Lab is subject to the ethical oversight of the University of Toronto, right? So I think that is something that can be a model for other groups that are outside of the university, especially some of my friends in civil society who do similar things to Citizen Lab, but they're not based at a university. I hope to encourage them to embody in the type of activities they do the same type of evidence-based impartial research that we've adopted at the Citizen Lab. I'm not sure if that answers entirely your question, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of some basic principles that are there for a reason. The internet itself is a product of the university environment. And it's from the universities that the internet was born. And we have to somehow, reinstill those principles at the heart of the internet because they've been lost, in my opinion. So in the red way up there.
Is it possible to shut off the beacon of mobile devices altogether?
Is it possible to shut off the beacons that I was describing in the mobile device? So it really depends on the functionality of your device. And I think whether this device or that can be turned off is, to me, less significant than the fact that we have, over the last decade, accelerating in the last 5 years or so, entered into a new relationship with information and communications. I describe it as turning our lives inside out. So whether you turn that cell phone on or off in terms of the beaconing, I think it's only a partial measure. And in fact, there's really little that you can do technologically to protect yourselves from surveillance. There's a great UCLA engineer, John Villa Sr., who has a great quote that I have in my book. He says, most of us don't remember what we did April 29th, 2011. We don't remember who we talked to, where we went, what we ate, what we purchased, what we watched on TV, what stores we went into. But all of that information is out there somewhere, and it can be recreated in perfect detail, right? And so in light of that, I think we need to think of solutions that are non-technological to this, essentially the surveillance society that we've entered into into laws and regulations that will provide checks and balances against the abuse of access to that type of information. That's the conversation that we have not had. We need effectively a new social contract. I was hoping I'd get that applause at the end of that. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say, perhaps after that, has there been a shift in the availability and the affordability of contracted and more associated cell phones in the last, say, 10 years as opposed to pay-as-you-go, which is more internet and other things?
That's a good question. He's asking a question about pay-as-you-go cell phones versus associated and so on. You know, I really don't know. I don't have statistics for you, but I do think that mobile phones, first of all, operate along an entirely different ecosystem than the internet. They're essentially walled gardens. And I think it's important to understand how, you know, Marshall McLuhan had this great phrase, the medium is the message. And by that he meant the technology we use shapes how we communicate in substantial ways. It's not just neutral. I think this is a good example. So most people now have mobile devices. Many people use them to communicate and access the internet through them. Because of the functionality, especially the small screen, we've moved away gradually and subtly from an environment where we would search the internet to access information to a situation today where information is pushed to us. It's sent to us through applications and within essentially a tunnel from the manufacturers of the handsets and the mobile devices to us individually. What can be sent to us can also be turned off. And I think there's a subtle difference there I think is very important that I've yet to get my head around. But I think it's something worth exploring. Jonathan Zittrain, one of my colleagues, wrote a book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, that was more or less on this topic that I think is outstanding. So there's somebody way at the back there with the hand up. Yes, that's you.
My concern, and obviously you've raised a lot of concerns, but is whether we even have a notion that privacy is a valuable thing anymore. And I don't see a lot of evidence that privacy is valuable. And so a lot of the concerns you have aren't going to strike home or resonate if you no longer feel that the very essence of privacy is something that as citizens we deserve or need.
Yeah, so the question was about, it was a comment about privacy and her feeling that privacy isn't valued to the same degree it was in the past. Am I right?
Can there be a grounds as well to achieve your goals?
Right, and there's obviously a generational issue here, right? I think younger people, generally speaking, are more comfortable giving away aspects of their personal lives that I think would be not considered appropriate by older generations. So I think we're going through a generational shift with respect to what is tolerated in terms of privacy infringements. I think, you know, privacy is obviously a very important principle. It's, you know, part of the Declaration of Human Rights. And it's within most countries' constitutions and charters. And I think it's there for a reason, not just for what many people assume, which is, you know, I don't want somebody spying on me or knowing what I'm doing behind closed doors or when the drapes are closed, although that may be important too. I think it's primarily there for another reason. It's to prevent the abuse of power that is unchecked. And that's really, I think, what we need to step back and think about when it comes to not only privacy but civil liberties protections. It's also why I encourage people to revisit the Watergate case, because that was not that long ago. It was a very formative experience for me. And remember what happened there. You had the machinery of government abused, especially the law enforcement apparatus of the state, by a paranoid person who was out to get his enemies. And there was a whole committee set up, the church committee afterwards, that made recommendations, including recommendations that created the very Foreign Intelligence Services Court that's supposed to oversee the operations of the NSA that's now been subverted in the Obama era. I think we need to go back and look at some fundamentals here about why principles like privacy are there. Why are they important to liberal democratic theory? It's actually about preventing the abuse of unchecked power. And that's what we need to think about in an age where so much information about us is given away, we secrete as part of our daily lives. Yes, sir.
Are there instances that you can cite? Because I feel like your talk covers several different topics. So there's a topic in the Western world about surveillance, spying, and then in the same breath it moves to issues like what we see in Syria, Pakistan, and Iran, and Afghanistan, where networks are shut down. People aren't allowed to have public discourse and free discourse to debate what's happening in society. And I feel like it's getting rolled into a ball of wax, and I don't feel like it's a productive conversation to pool them together. In the Western world that we live in, we have a great deal of freedom to use the internet at will, to have discussions, set up websites about any political topic, mostly. Are there examples where we're being constrained in the West, where our privacy is being violated in a way that is against what we expect? I don't know if that's...
Well, I mean, on one level, there's a very obvious response to that, and that's, just pick up the newspaper today, right? I mean... Outside of the... I thought you were headed in a slightly different direction, which is, well, why do those things in the global south matter to us? How will they impact us? So why should we be concerned about it? Why am I lumping it all together? And I think it's very important to understand that, technology may be designed for a specific purpose. The inventors of cell phones and the internet and so on may have had certain uses in mind. But human ingenuity is boundless, and people can end up using things for purposes that were totally unintended by their creators. And where I've seen that most directly, acutely, is in the global south, and especially in zones of conflict, in the most vulnerable, fragile states. Things like mobile phones and so on end up being used for purposes that we never conceived of. Somalia, I write about this in Black Code. Many people might be surprised to find out that it has one of the most efficient and competitive cell phone infrastructures of all of sub-Saharan Africa, in spite of the fact that there's no centralized government there and hasn't been for decades. And that's because it's used by militias and organized criminal elements, and of course by the huge diaspora population. Somalis who go to work abroad and then transfer remittances. And for security reasons, too. There is a very advanced online banking system through mobile phones in Somalia, in a place where life expectancy is like, something like 39 or whatever. Why? Because no one wants to carry around cash. And so entrepreneurs there have developed a mobile transfer system. That's a kind of nice story. An interesting story. But there are ways in which the next billion users of the internet will eventually and inevitably impact how we use the technology. Because the design of that technology will be something that we will have to accept. And I think that's where things become a concern, and why we need to think about what we're doing here sets a standard, a model for practices that will happen abroad. I'll give you just one example. BlackBerry. Okay, what was BlackBerry's signature feature? Security, right? So BlackBerry, starting in about 2010, you may remember, started receiving demands from governments, beginning first in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, then in Indonesia and India. You must give us access to your encryption keys. And what did we hear from BlackBerry? Even we can't access our secret sauce because it's so secret, even we can't do this. And maybe there's something different between the consumer level BlackBerry and the enterprise one. And, but anyway, we can't make any deals, no special arrangements. There was at one point the former CEO of BlackBerry, Mike Lazaridis, actually walked off a show on the BBC saying that's a national security matter when he was asked directly about this. What we now know is that BlackBerry actually made deals, right? It's obvious. And if you look at the timeline, that's precisely when security agencies in the West began abandoning BlackBerry. The word went around. BlackBerry product is not as secure as we think it is. And they've made arrangements with governments like United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and so on, and they're not being straightforward about it. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, how something there can come back and impact us directly. In this case, I think it's actually affected the viability of a company that used to be the hallmark company in the telecom sector in Canada. Yes?
We were in Shanghai over the summer, and we found that YouTube was blocked completely by the Chinese government. It was just a blank screen. And Facebook. But what encouraged me a lot was the local kids immediately told us there's a little program you can buy, you pay a little bit of money, and it just goes around the block, and they're watching YouTube all day long. I don't wish to sound naive about this, but what good news do you have for us about individual initiative? Because it seems to be the genius of the internet is individual initiative. Yeah. People who just refuse to be bound by any system.
Yeah. So a very good comment about, well, the question was, what good news do you have for us? But the comment was about human ingenuity, and I very much agree with you. I wouldn't be doing this if I weren't a believer in what you're saying and the bottom line. And I have some news for you.
How much of that has your study done?
Well, here's my news for you. The Citizen Lab invented one of the world's most widely used circumvention systems, Siphon, in 2006. It probably was being used by the very people you talk about. So we're very intimately involved in that. Not as much as we were in the past, but we still are very much interested in it and study it. The Chinese case is really interesting. We did a study in 2008 of the Chinese version of Skype because we had heard rumors that on the chat client of Skype, when people typed in certain keywords, they just wouldn't appear in the chat client. Words like democracy and Tiananmen Square. So if I'm a firm believer in blank, right? So what we did is we set up an experiment in the lab with 2 computers, and we started typing in what we suspected would be banned keywords, and then had a client on another computer receiving them. And then we had in between the connection a network sniffing tool called Wireshark that allowed us to see what was going on beneath the surface. And what was happening is that every time we typed in one of those keywords, a connection was being made to a server in mainland China that shouldn't have been happening, right? It's like, okay, why is that happening? Let's take a look at this server. So we went to the server and we explored it a bit. We found out there's a directory that was not password protected. And we opened up the directory, and inside were what appeared to be a whole bunch of encrypted files and then the decryption key. Whoever did that is not very smart. Nonetheless, there it is. So we opened it up, and what we found were millions of personal chats. So every time someone typed in one of those keywords, from that point on, all of their chats were vacuumed up by Skype and shared presumably with Chinese security services. This was front page in the business section of the New York Times in 2008. Skype apologized. It was scandalous. Last year, we got together with researchers at the University of New Mexico, and they said we should revisit that case. So over the last 12 months, and we just published a study, if you look at the Citizen Lab site, this is the most detailed study on Chinese instant messaging clients. So in collaboration with these University of New Mexico researchers, we took the clients, reverse engineered them, which if it was done to clients here might be considered against the law, but anyway. different conversation. So we did this, and what we found out is thousands of keywords are uploaded on a daily basis to the chat clients that trigger surveillance. Not even content filtering anymore, not even banned keywords. It's a surveillance. This is like remarkable. So it's still going on. In fact, it's way worse than ever before. So there's a backdoor in the Chinese version of Skype and almost all of the other Chinese chat clients. Now, I'm not saying that to prove it wrong, but I think it's important to understand that it's hard to know what's going on if you can't see it. So there are obvious things like YouTube, and okay, it's blocked, and I'm going to get around it. But governments like China are beginning to realize that that's a very crude way to implement social control. It's much more effective to monitor people, and most importantly, to create a climate of self-censorship so that people feel like somebody's actually watching me. And if I do something that violates the interests of that all-seeing eye, I may get in trouble. And I think that's what we have to worry about, is that climate of self-censorship, that kind of social control that's insidious. I do think it can be overcome. I work a lot with people who try to not only circumvent censorship of the type you describe. As I said, we invented one of the world's leading versions of that. And ultimately, I hope that in the long run, that sort of ingenuity will win out. Our research of what we're talking about here, I think, is an illustration of that type of ingenuity. We have to expose what's going on if we want to know what surrounds us, what constrains us as individuals. Oh, Max is coming with the big hook.
Professor Richard Price from the Department of Political Science. A few words about this.
Well, I was hoping to catch a rare night of good sleep tonight, Ron. Thanks a lot.
An extra hour.
Exactly. It's really a genuine pleasure to thank Ron for being here tonight. I had the distinct pleasure of reading his PhD dissertation just a few years ago, which, as Max Cameron mentioned, became a book called Parchment Printing and Hypermedia. And that book is really fascinating because it set the table for exactly what Ron has been doing ever since. He laid out a thesis that the change of what he called then hypermedia, which he told you about tonight, was this revolutionary change for how we think and organize ourselves politically, as was the printing press, which gave the possibility of the Bible in every hand, and all of a sudden faith could become personal instead of relying on the priest, the transformation of politics, and so on. And the wonderful thing is that from that path-breaking book, Ron really put himself in place of an incredible tradition, which Max mentioned, of Canadian thinkers about technology. Harold Innis, Marshall McLuhan, whose famous phrase you mentioned tonight, George Grant, and many others. And Ron has really inherited that mantle, I think, and we can have an interesting conversation about why it is that there is this tradition of Canadian thinkers, perhaps just on the edge of the periphery of the dominant empire.
It's the beer.
But one of the interesting things is that Ron has done much more than that. He hasn't just written and thought about it, but he has become one of the preeminently important activists on these issues. And that's really important because he has come to embody what he early on analyzed as the dark side, but also the positive side. And one of the questioners asked about the positive side, and he's been kind of modest. He's told you some of the things about what Citizen Lab has done. But Ron really embodies that civil society activism, which we need, which we really need today. He's underscored the reasons why we need it today. And unlike the Snowdens and the Assanges and others, Ron has neither been exiled, indicted, nor arrested.
Yeah.
So perhaps that
my mother's here. Don't scare her.
But I think that says something very important about what Ron has mentioned several times tonight, which is the importance of the place of the university as a place for this kind of activity and the privileged place that it has. And Ron really embodies the very best of that tradition. So please.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.